On a winter morning in 1998, in the quiet hills of Arkansas, a young woman named Melissa Witt stepped out of a bowling alley parking lot and vanished into the cold December air. She was 19 years old, with auburn hair and a bright smile that friends said could light up any room. Her car remained locked in the parking lot of a Bowling World in Fort Smith, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no screams heard in the night. Just the absolute silence of someone there one moment and gone the next. For 25 years, her disappearance would haunt a community, baffle investigators, and leave her mother searching for answers in every shadow and stranger's face. The case would grow cold, the leads would dry up, and the questions would multiply in the darkness. But somewhere in that silence, someone knew what happened. Someone had watched Melissa walk across that parking lot. Someone had been waiting. And the question that would echo through decades was simple and terrible. Who took Melissa Witt, and how long could they hide in plain sight? Fort Smith, Arkansas sits pressed against the Oklahoma border, a city built on frontier history and river commerce, where the Arkansas River carves through limestone bluffs and red clay hills. In 1994, 4 years before Melissa Witt disappeared, Fort Smith was a city of roughly 80,000 people, a place where neighbor knew neighbor, where Friday night football drew crowds, and where young people cruised Garrison Avenue on weekend evenings. The summers were brutal with humidity. The winters arrived sharp and sudden, stripping the oak trees bare and turning the sky the color of old steel. The Bowling World sat on Towson Avenue, a busy commercial strip lined with chain restaurants and retail stores, the kind of thoroughly ordinary American landscape that exists in 1,000 cities. Neon signs glowed against the December darkness. Cars pulled in and out of parking spaces. Inside the bowling alley, the sounds were familiar. The crash of pins, the rumble of balls down hardwood lanes, the electronic beeps of arcade games, voices raised in competition and laughter. Melissa Witt was 19 years old that December night in 1994. She lived with her mother, Mary Ann, in a modest home not far from the bowling alley. Friends described Melissa as outgoing and friendly, someone who made conversation easily, who worked hard at her job and talked about her plans for the future. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed about 110 pounds, and had that distinctive auburn hair that caught the light. On the night of December 1st, she wore jeans and a black shirt, nothing flashy, just the casual uniform of a Thursday evening out. The evening began ordinarily enough. Melissa had made plans to meet her mother at the bowling alley around 6:30. Mary Ann Witt was already there, bowling in a league, and Melissa planned to join her, perhaps bowl a few games, spend time together before heading home. This was their routine, nothing unusual, nothing that raised any concern. Melissa left their home sometime after 6, driving her white Mazda sedan through the December darkness. The temperature that evening hovered in the low 40s. A light wind moved through the bare tree branches. The parking lot at Bowling World was well lit but sprawling, with cars scattered across the asphalt expanse. Witnesses later recalled seeing Melissa's car in the parking lot around 6:45. The white Mazda sat perhaps 75 yards from the bowling alley entrance, parked at an angle in the outer section of the lot where spaces were easier to find. What happened in those next minutes remains disputed, reconstructed from fragments of memory and later testimony. Some witnesses reported seeing a young woman matching Melissa's description walking across the parking lot, moving toward the entrance. Others recalled seeing a vehicle, possibly a pickup truck, circling the lot slowly, its headlights cutting through the darkness. But memories are unreliable, especially when questioned months or years after the fact, especially when people did not know they were witnessing something important. Inside the bowling alley, Mary Ann Witt bowled her games and waited. Clear's throat, 6:30 came and went. 7 o'clock arrived. Still no Melissa. This was not like her daughter. Melissa was punctual, responsible. If something had delayed her, she would have called. Mary Ann felt the first flutter of concern, that maternal instinct that recognizes when patterns break, when something sits wrong in the universe. By 7:30, Mary Ann walked out to the parking lot, scanning the rows of cars for Melissa's white Mazda. She found it quickly, parked in that outer section, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, doors locked. The car sat empty. No note, no explanation, just an abandoned vehicle in a busy parking lot on a Thursday evening. Mary Ann's concern transformed into fear. She alerted bowling alley staff. They called the Fort Smith Police Department. Officers arrived and searched the immediate area, walking through the parking lot with flashlights, checking nearby businesses, asking questions of anyone who might have seen something. The bowling alley staff could not recall seeing Melissa enter the building. No one remembered her approaching the entrance. The search expanded quickly. Police canvassed the surrounding area, checking dumpsters and wooded areas near the bowling alley, looking for any sign of the missing young woman. They interviewed people leaving the bowling alley, asking if anyone had noticed a young woman with auburn hair, anyone who might have seen a confrontation or struggle. The answers came back negative. In a parking lot full of people coming and going, somehow no one had witnessed what happened to Melissa Witt. Detectives processed her car. The keys in the ignition suggested she had been taken before she could even turn off the engine. Or perhaps she had left the car running, planning to return in just a moment. Her purse remained untouched, containing identification, money, personal items. This was not a robbery. This was something else entirely. By midnight, search teams combed through the wooded areas surrounding Towson Avenue. Volunteers from the community joined police and sheriff's deputies, calling Melissa's name into the darkness, shining lights through tree branches and ravines. The December wind carried their voices away. The night yielded nothing. For those who have ever waited for someone who never arrives, who have felt that terrible transition from annoyance to concern to fear, the hours after Melissa's disappearance were an agony of mounting dread. Mary Ann Witt remained at the bowling alley, then at the police station, answering questions, providing photographs, describing what her daughter had been wearing. Officers asked about boyfriends, recent arguments, anyone who might wish Melissa harm. Mary Ann could think of no one. Melissa had friends, people who cared about her. She had no enemies that her mother knew of. The first 24 hours passed, then 48. The media coverage began, local news stations broadcasting Melissa's photograph, describing her disappearance, asking for information from the public. Tips came in, as they always do in high-profile cases. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station 30 miles away. Another caller reported a young woman matching her description hitchhiking on Highway 71. Investigators followed each lead, finding nothing concrete, nothing that brought them closer to understanding what happened in that parking lot. Days became weeks. The search continued, expanding to cover rural areas outside Fort Smith, following up on reports and rumors. Volunteers organized search parties every weekend, walking through fields and forests, checking abandoned buildings and creek beds. The December cold deepened. Christmas approached, and Melissa's empty chair at the family table spoke louder than any words. Part 2. The Investigation. The Fort Smith Police Department and Sebastian County Sheriff's Office worked the case with the urgency it deserved. Lead Detective Max Nolan, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness, assembled a task force. They mapped Melissa's movements in the days before her disappearance, interviewed her friends and coworkers, searched her room for any clue about where she might have gone or who might have wanted to harm her. Those who knew Melissa described a young woman without serious problems or dangerous entanglements. She worked at a local restaurant, saved money, talked about maybe going to college eventually. She dated casually but had no serious boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Her friends could recall no threatening encounters, no stalker, no one who had made her uncomfortable. She was, by all accounts, just an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life until the moment she was not. The parking lot became the focus of intense investigation. Detectives measured distances, timed how long it would take to walk from various parking spots to the entrance. They interviewed every employee working that night, every league bowler, every person who had a receipt showing they were at Bowling World on December 1st. The picture that emerged was frustratingly incomplete. The parking lot had been busy. People had been coming and going constantly. In that traffic of ordinary life, someone had taken Melissa, and apparently no one had noticed anything unusual enough to remember. Security footage would have solved everything, but Bowling World in 1994 had no external cameras covering the parking lot. The technology existed, but many businesses had not yet invested in comprehensive surveillance systems. That gap in coverage provided whoever took Melissa with a window of opportunity. Investigators received reports about a pickup truck seen circling the parking lot around the time of Melissa's disappearance. Multiple witnesses mentioned it, though descriptions varied. Some said it was dark-colored, perhaps blue or black. Others thought it might have been red. The make and model remained unclear. One witness recalled seeing a truck parked near Melissa's Mazda, but could not say with certainty that anyone from the truck had approached her car. Clear's throat. The investigation expanded to include known offenders in the area, anyone with a history of assault or abduction. Detectives interviewed dozens of men, checking alibis, looking for any connection to Melissa or the bowling alley. They found nothing that held together under scrutiny. 6 weeks after her disappearance, on January 19, 1995, hunters discovered human remains in a remote wooded area off Highway 71, roughly 25 miles from Fort Smith near the small community of Greenwood. The body lay partially concealed in thick underbrush, down a steep embankment from the highway. Decomposition and animal activity had done their work over the cold weeks. Dental records confirmed what investigators feared. The remains belonged to Melissa Witt. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case to a homicide. The medical examiner's report noted ligature marks on the skeletal remains, suggesting Melissa had been bound. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, though the exact mechanism remained unclear given the condition of the remains. What was clear was that Melissa had been murdered, her body dumped in a location chosen for its remoteness and difficulty of access. The crime scene told a limited story. Tire tracks nearby suggested a vehicle had pulled off the highway, but weeks of weather had degraded any useful tread patterns. Investigators searched the area thoroughly, finding no wallet, no jewelry, no personal effects that might have fallen from the killer's pockets. The location itself suggested local knowledge. Highway 71 was a main route, but the specific turnoff where Melissa's body was found was not obviously visible from the road. Someone had known this spot existed, had perhaps scouted it beforehand. Detectives constructed timelines. Melissa had disappeared around 6:45 on December 1st. Her body was found 25 miles away. The drive would have taken perhaps 30 minutes. Had she been killed immediately and driven directly to the dump site? Or had she been held somewhere first before being murdered and disposed of? The medical examination could not determine time of death with enough precision to answer those questions. The task force interviewed everyone again, this time with the knowledge that they were hunting a killer. They looked harder at the men in Melissa's life, re-examining alibis, checking phone records, searching for any crack in the stories. They found nothing that rose to the level of probable cause. Tips continued to flow in. A psychic called claiming to have visions about the murder. Anonymous letters arrived at the police station, some accusing specific individuals, others rambling and incoherent. Investigators followed every credible lead, but the case began to develop the frustrating quality of a puzzle with missing pieces. Those who worked the investigation whispered quietly among themselves about the professionalism of the crime. Whoever had abducted Melissa had done so in a busy parking lot without being seen. They had killed her, transported her body, and disposed of it in a way that delayed discovery for 6 weeks. This suggested planning, control, knowledge of forensic investigation. This was not a crime of sudden passion but something more calculated. The months passed. The investigation consumed thousands of hours. Detectives traveled to neighboring states following leads. They consulted with FBI behavioral analysts who built a profile of the likely offender. Male, probably between 25 and 45 years old, familiar with the Fort Smith area, possibly with a history of controlling or violent behavior toward women, someone who could maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring dangerous impulses. But profiles do not solve cases. Evidence solves cases, and the physical evidence remained stubbornly limited. No DNA had been recovered from Melissa's remains or her car. No fingerprints linked an unknown individual to the scene. No witness had come forward with information specific enough to identify a suspect. By late 1995, the investigation had slowed. Detectives continued to work the case, but new leads had dried up. The task force was reassigned to other duties, though Detective Nolan kept the case file on his desk. Mary Ann Witt called regularly, asking for updates, begging investigators not to forget her daughter. They promised they would not, and they meant it. But without new information, the case drifted into that terrible category of unsolved murders, filed away but never closed, waiting for the break that might never come. Part 3: The Silence. The years that followed Melissa's murder moved with the strange dual quality of time after trauma, simultaneously frozen and racing forward. Mary Ann Witt remained in Fort Smith for several years, unable to leave the place where her daughter had last been alive, where her memory still walked the streets and echoed in familiar places. But living with loss in the same location where it occurred carries its own unbearable weight. In 1998, Mary Ann made the difficult decision to relocate. She moved to a small town several hundred miles away, seeking distance from the constant reminders, from the bowling alley that still stood on Towson Avenue, from the well-meaning neighbors whose pity had become its own burden. She took Melissa's photographs, her belongings, the case file she had assembled herself with newspaper clippings and police reports obtained through public records requests. The investigation continued in fits and starts. New detectives inherited the case as older ones retired. Each brought fresh eyes but reached the same frustrating conclusions. The physical evidence was limited. The witness statements were vague. The list of possible suspects was either too long or too short, depending on how strictly one applied the criteria. In Fort Smith, life moved forward as it always does. The bowling alley continued its business. Towson Avenue added new stores and restaurants. Younger residents who had been children in 1994 grew up hearing whispered versions of Melissa Witt's story, the cautionary tale about the girl who vanished from a parking lot on a Thursday evening. Her case became part of local lore, mentioned in discussions about safety, invoked when parents warned children about strangers. But for those who had known Melissa personally, time did not diminish the loss. Friends who had been 19 years old in 1994 were now in their 30s, building careers, raising families, living the life that Melissa never got to live. Some moved away. Others stayed, carrying the memory like a stone in their pockets. Detective Max Nolan retired in 2003, having never solved the case that haunted him most. At his retirement party, colleagues say he mentioned Melissa Witt in his speech, apologizing to her mother for not finding her killer. Other detectives took up the file. Technology advanced. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Cold case units formed specifically to re-examine old evidence with new techniques. In 2010, the Fort Smith Police Department created a dedicated cold case unit and assigned 2 investigators to review unsolved homicides. Melissa Witt's case was among the first they examined. They re-interviewed witnesses who were still alive and willing to talk. They sent evidence for updated DNA testing. They entered information into national databases that had not existed in 1994. The DNA testing revealed male DNA on ligatures that had bound Melissa, but no match existed in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. This told investigators that whoever had murdered Melissa had never been arrested for a felony serious enough to require DNA collection, or had committed the crime before DNA databases were widely used. The DNA was a profile without a name, evidence waiting for technology and luck to provide a suspect for comparison. Clears throat for those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether someone close to you is capable of terrible things. The years after Melissa's murder contained their own quiet investigations. People in Fort Smith looked at neighbors differently. Wives wondered about husbands who had no alibis for that December evening. Friends recalled men who had seemed too interested in the case, who had asked too many questions, who had volunteered for searches with an enthusiasm that, in retrospect, felt wrong. But suspicion without evidence is just poison. It corrodes communities and ruins reputations. And so most people kept their doubts to themselves, unwilling to accuse without proof, uncertain if their instincts were sound or merely paranoid. The case appeared occasionally in media coverage, especially on anniversaries of Melissa's disappearance. Local television stations produced retrospectives. True crime bloggers discussed the case online, proposing theories, arguing about suspects, analyzing the scant evidence. Some of this attention generated new tips, though most led nowhere. In 2015, 21 years after Melissa's murder, the Fort Smith Police Department announced they were reopening the active investigation, assigning additional resources, bringing in experts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They created a dedicated tip line. They offered a reward for information leading to an arrest. They released additional details about the crime, hoping that something might shake loose from someone's memory. Mary Ann Witt, now in her 60s, gave interviews from her home far from Fort Smith. She spoke about Melissa with a mother's perfect recall, describing her daughter's laugh, her habits, her dreams. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. She said she needed to know who had taken her daughter from her. She said she needed justice before she died. The investigation utilized new techniques unavailable in 1994. Digital forensics, cell tower analysis, though cell phone usage was not widespread in the early 90s. Social media research, tracking down people who had been at Bowling World that night and might have since posted about it online. Genealogical DNA analysis, using the male DNA found on the ligatures to build family trees, narrowing down possible suspects through their relatives' genetic profiles. This last technique, genealogical DNA analysis, had gained prominence after solving several high-profile cold cases. Investigators uploaded the unknown male DNA profile to genealogical databases used by people researching their family histories. They found matches several generations removed and began building family trees forward, identifying living male relatives who might be the source of the crime scene DNA. The work was painstaking. Family trees branched in countless directions. Investigators had to locate descendants, obtain comparison DNA samples through voluntary submission or discarded items, eliminate possibilities one by one. The process took months. In late 2018, the family tree research narrowed to a single branch. Multiple genetic markers pointed to a family that had lived in Fort Smith in the 1990s. The investigators focused on males in the right age range who had been in the area at the time of Melissa's disappearance. One name emerged with increasing prominence: Larry Gene Bell Jr., a man who in 1994 had been 38 years old, living in Fort Smith, working in construction. Investigators pulled his records. He had no major criminal history, just a few minor traffic violations. He had never been required to submit DNA to any database. He had lived quietly, working various jobs, moving between Arkansas and Oklahoma over the years. Detectives located Bell in early 2019, living in a small town in Oklahoma, working at a warehouse. They placed him under surveillance, watching his movements, looking for an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample without alerting him to the investigation. In March 2019, investigators recovered a discarded cigarette butt from outside his workplace. They submitted it for DNA analysis. The results came back several weeks later. The DNA from the cigarette butt matched the male DNA found on the ligatures that had bound Melissa Witt 25 years earlier. The probability of the match being coincidental was calculated at 1 in several trillion. Part 4. The Revelation. On May 7, 2019, just after dawn, a team of investigators from Fort Smith Police Department and the FBI arrested Larry Gene Bell Jr. outside his residence in Lexington, Oklahoma. Body camera footage from the arrest shows Bell, now 63 years old, emerging from his house in work clothes, coffee cup in hand, clearly surprised by the presence of law enforcement vehicles in his driveway. "Larry Gene Bell, you are under arrest for the murder of Melissa Witt," the lead detective stated, reading him his Miranda rights while other officers secured the scene. Bell's reaction, according to the arrest report, was notable for its lack of visible emotion. He did not ask why he was being arrested. He did not claim innocence or express confusion. He simply stood silently, allowing himself to be handcuffed, his face registering what witnesses described as resignation rather than surprise. The arrest made immediate news. Fort Smith television stations interrupted regular programming to announce the development. Mary Ann Witt, reached by phone at her home, broke down in tears on camera. 25 years, she said. 25 years I have waited for this day." Investigators transported Bell back to Fort Smith, where he was booked into Sebastian County Detention Center. The initial court appearance was set for May 9th. Media coverage was extensive. Reporters researched Bell's background, interviewing people who had known him in 1994, looking for any hints of the violence he had allegedly committed. What they found was a portrait of a man who had lived largely under the radar. Bell had worked construction jobs, performed odd labor, lived in modest apartments and rental houses. He had been married briefly in the 1980s but divorced with no children. Former coworkers described him as quiet, someone who kept to himself, did his work, and left. Several people recalled that he drove a pickup truck in the 1990s, though the specific color and make varied in different accounts. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Bell had frequented Bowling World in 1994. He had bowled in a Thursday evening league that met at the same time as Mary Ann Witt's league. He would have been at the bowling alley on December 1st, 1994, the night Melissa disappeared. This detail electrified the investigation. Bell had not just been in the general area. He had been at the specific location where Melissa was last seen. The probability of coincidence collapsed. The case against him strengthened from DNA evidence alone to DNA evidence plus opportunity. Prosecutors filed formal charges, capital murder with aggravating circumstances. The potential penalty was death, though Arkansas had not executed anyone in several years. The case was assigned to a seasoned prosecutor known for handling complex cold cases. Bell's court-appointed attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment. The attorney argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that Bell's presence at Bowling World was not proof of guilt, that the prosecution could not demonstrate motive or intent beyond reasonable doubt. The legal proceedings moved through the system with the deliberate pace that major criminal cases require. Pre-trial hearings addressed the admissibility of the DNA evidence, the chain of custody for evidence stored for 25 years, the reliability of genealogical DNA matching. The defense challenged the science, bringing in expert witnesses who questioned the methodology. But the prosecution's case was strong. They presented the DNA match, explaining in detail how the genealogical analysis had been conducted, how the probability calculations worked, how the comparison sample from Bell's cigarette butt definitively matched the crime scene DNA. They presented testimony from FBI forensic analysts, from genealogists who had built the family trees, from statisticians who explained the astronomical odds against the match being coincidental. They also presented circumstantial evidence. Bell owned a pickup truck matching general descriptions from witnesses in 1994. His work schedule allowed him to be at Bowling World on Thursday evenings. Phone records from 1994, though incomplete, showed no calls from Bell's home phone on the evening of December 1st, suggesting he had been out. Bank records showed no ATM usage that would have placed him elsewhere. More damning were statements Bell himself made after his arrest. Though he invoked his right to remain silent initially, he later agreed to speak with investigators in recorded interviews. These conversations, played in court, revealed a man who seemed to know details about Melissa's murder that had never been made public. In one exchange, Detective Sarah Martinez asked Bell about the location where Melissa's body had been found. "How would you know about that specific turnoff on Highway 71?" she asked. Bell paused for several seconds before answering. "I used to hunt out that way," he said. "Back in the 90s, I knew those woods." "Did you know Melissa Witt?" Martinez asked. "I saw her around," Bell admitted, "at the bowling alley." "Did you talk to her?" "Maybe once or twice, nothing special." "Did you kill her?" Bell looked at the table between them. Clear's throat, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. "I think I need to talk to my lawyer." The interviews ended there, but the admissions Bell had already made proved significant. He had placed himself at Bowling World. He had acknowledged knowing who Melissa was. He had admitted familiarity with the dump site. The trial was scheduled for September 2020 but was delayed by the pandemic. It eventually began in March 2021 in a Fort Smith courtroom filled with media, victim advocates, and members of the community who had followed the case for decades. Mary Ann Witt sat in the front row every day, her hands folded in her lap, watching the man accused of murdering her daughter. The prosecution presented its case over 2 weeks, methodically building the evidence. The defense argued that DNA evidence proved only that Bell had touched the ligatures at some point, not necessarily during the commission of the crime. They suggested contamination, laboratory error, coincidence. But the jury, after deliberating for 4 days, returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. Bell showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Mary Ann Witt wept quietly. At the sentencing hearing several weeks later, Mary Ann Witt addressed the court. "You took my daughter from me," she said, looking directly at Bell. "You stole her future, her dreams, everything she could have become. You made me wait 25 years for justice. But today, finally, I can say that Melissa's voice has been heard." The judge sentenced Bell to life in prison without possibility of parole. Arkansas had recently abolished the death penalty for all but the most exceptional cases, and the prosecution had not pursued capital punishment given Bell's age and the length of time since the crime. Bell was transported to Arkansas Department of Corrections, where he remains incarcerated. He has never confessed to the crime. He has never explained what happened in that parking lot, what motivated him to abduct and kill a young woman he barely knew. The only certainty is that DNA, time, and persistent investigation finally connected him to a crime he likely thought he had gotten away with. Closing. The arrest and conviction of Larry Gene Bell in the murder of Melissa Witt represents both justice achieved and justice delayed. 25 years is a long time to wait for answers. It is a lifetime for those who loved Melissa, who marked every birthday she did not celebrate, every Christmas without her presence, every milestone she never reached. The case demonstrates the power of persistence in investigation, the importance of preserving evidence even when cases go cold, and the revolutionary potential of new forensic techniques. Genealogical DNA analysis has solved dozens of cold cases in recent years, bringing resolution to families who had given up hope. But it also reminds us of the arbitrary nature of justice, how it depends on technological advancement, investigative resources, and sometimes simple luck. Other families wait still, their cases lacking the single piece of evidence that could break them open. Melissa Witt was 19 years old when she died. She had plans, dreams, a future she never got to live. Her murder was not the end of her story, though. Her story continued in her mother's advocacy, in the detectives who refused to forget, in the community that kept her memory alive, and ultimately in the courtroom where her killer finally faced judgment. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.